Before we commence, if I could respectfully request those whose mobile phones are not yet silenced to please do so at this point. For the speeches, ladies in the back are welcome to occupy the seats over there. Not a problem, thank you. Her Excellency, the Honourable Linda Dessau, Governor of Victoria, Mr. Anthony Howard, Rabbis and Rebbitzins, Professor David Kopolov, Pro-Vice-Chancellor, representing Professor Margaret Gardner, President and Vice-Chancellor of Monash University, members of the judiciary, professors of law, parliamentarians, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. The President of the St Kilda Hebrew Congregation, Harold Sternfeld, shares his apologies that he is unable to be here this evening as he is currently interstate. On his behalf, on behalf of Rebbitzin Sarah and the Board of Management of the St Kilda Hebrew Congregation, we welcome you here this evening to mark the Shloshim, the 30-day mourning period of a remarkable man, a man that we are here to honour, Professor Louis Waller of blessed memory, Zichrono Livracha. It is physically impossible to encapsulate in the few moments that lie ahead a man who made such a remarkable impact on this great state, in law, in the Jewish community, and in so many other areas. Professor Waller was certainly small in size, but a giant in stature. A giant as an academic, a giant as a community stalwart, a giant as a family man, but perhaps most importantly, a giant in his heart. As Jews, we have a fundamental belief that nothing that occurs in this world is by coincidence, chance, or simply the product of probabilities or quarks in the universe, but rather that every single occurrence is divinely providential and imbued with meaning, significance, and spiritual relevance. And so, when I arrived here at Shul on the morning of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and one of my congregants had the unenviable task of informing me that the night before, on Kol Nidrei night, Professor Waller had passed away, I thought to myself, God elected to take this man's soul to return it to its maker on the holiest night of the year. And that indeed is divinely providential. A unique and distinctive man who left this world on the most unique and distinctive day in the Jewish calendar. It is customary, my friends, that at this time we recite, albeit briefly, a Mishnah. A Mishnah literally means a teaching, but on a deeper level, the Hebrew word Mishnah consists, as we know, of 4 letters, the Mem, the Shin, the Nun, and the Hey. And when one transposes those 4 letters, one arrives at the word neshama, the soul. For reciting words of Mishnah in memory of someone who left this world elevates that person's soul onto the next. And so when I thought to myself, what is an appropriate Mishnah, an appropriate teaching from Ethics of Our Fathers? This morning, after the morning services, it is our custom here at St Kilda Shul to recite one Mishnah from Ethics of Our Fathers per day. And we go in order. And today we read out the 15th Mishnah of the first chapter of Ethics, and it reads as follows. Shammai Omer, the great sage Shammai, said as follows, words that I believe are a wonderful illustration of the Professor Louis Waller that we have come to love and know. Aseh Torat Chakva, make your Torah study something permanent. Emor ma'at va'aseh harbeh, say little, but do much. And equally importantly and finally, u'makabel et kol ha'adam b'sever panim yafot, to greet every person with whom one interacts with a smiling countenance and with a sense of welcome. Professor Waller made Toratcha Kavah, his Torah, his faith, his religious beliefs, his practices, his rituals, and our traditions had a sense of permanence in his life, and we are going to hear more about that in a moment. He was also a man of few words. When he spoke, those words were imbued with meaning. He spoke judiciously, deliberately, and with a great sense of thought. Perhaps one could say that one learned more from Professor Louis Waller from what he did not say than from what he did. Indeed, he taught us much with his words, but it was his ability to refrain from idle chatter, from gossip, from the mundanities that sometimes we preoccupy ourselves with in today's generation that marked him as the true individual that he was. But to me, perhaps most importantly, and in conclusion, Professor Waller was someone who would greet every person with a shining countenance, with a smile, and with a sense of welcome. And the reason for this is simple. It was because despite his enormous achievements and his tremendous academic accomplishments, Louis Waller remained grounded in this world. He never let it get to his head. He remained humble and true to himself. And so whenever someone approached him, whoever that person was, accomplished or unaccomplished, Professor Waller would greet that person and welcome them with a smile. How fortunate are we at St Kilda Shul to have had such a long-standing relationship with Professor Waller, which will also be expounded on in a few moments. And on a personal note, I wish to communicate to Wendy and to the entire family what an honor and privilege it was for me personally to have gotten to know Professor Waller over the past 8 years as he would frequent our shul on various times throughout the year, of course, except on the Shabbat, because he kept the Shabbat and did not drive, and we are way out of walking distance from where he lived. But it was in those opportunities that I got to engage with him, to talk to him, to stand up here on the Bima, on Purim, to sit alongside him on the sad day of Tisha B'Av when he would frequent our shul regularly. It was in those interactions and in those moments that I gained insight into the tremendous man that we are honoring today. We are going to invite 3 speakers, as detailed on the brochures in front of you. Ian Waller, QC, Louis' son, who will talk about Louis as a Jewish life. Jack Fajgenbaum, QC, a long-standing friend and colleague, who will talk about Louis in the sense of his legal life. And Avital Seifman, a granddaughter of Louis, who will talk about her grandfather from the context of his family life. Friends, I ask you to join in with me as we listen to a few short words, again, incapable of encapsulating the great man that he was, but no doubt to provide us a window into the wonderful legacy that Professor Louis Waller left. Thank you.
Speaking at a dinner in honour of my father in 2000, Justice Michael Kirby, then a High Court judge, said, "In a life such as Louis Waller has lived, it is not enough to begin with his academic laurels. To understand him and the wellsprings of his humanity, it is essential to journey back to Siedlitz in Poland." My father, Peter Louis Waller, Pinchas Yehuda ben Yaakov Dov HaKohen Hareni Kaparat Mishkavo, was born Pinchas Leib Valigora in Siedlitz, Poland on the 9th of February 1935. His birth was registered by his father the following day, so the 10th of February became his official birthday. Like many other cities in Europe, Siedlitz, which is situated about 100 kilometres east of Warsaw, had a significant Jewish population. In 1935, Jews constituted some 40% of the city's population of 30,000. But of course, all of that changed forever during the Second World War. And by the end of 1942, almost every member of its Jewish population had been murdered in Treblinka. That was the same fate that befell almost all of my father's Siedlitz family. Somehow, sensing the impending doom, Dad's parents managed to leave Poland with their 3-year-old son in 1938 and made their way by sea to Melbourne. Dad's parents had both been raised in Orthodox Hasidic homes. Indeed, the Sundeck at my father's bris in 1935, given the honour of holding him while he was circumcised, was the Biala Rebbe. There were also strong family connections on my grandmother's side to the Alexander Rebbe. Dad's father received a cheder and yeshiva education in Shedlitz, but after he was conscripted in 1919 for 4 years in the newly formed Polish army, he became a fervent supporter of the Linke Poalei Zion, the left-wing socialist Zionist movement, and the lifestyle that was associated with it. So by the time they arrived in Melbourne with their 3-year-old son, my grandparents' religious observance had diminished. But my grandparents had decided that their son would have a Jewish education and a Jewish life. They understood that while in Shedlitz, Yiddishkeit, the Jewish way of life, was all pervasive, whatever one's personal practice was, in Melbourne they had to work at being Jewish if they wanted to ensure that Dad would remain so. So in 1940, aged 5, Dad became a pupil at the St Kilda Hebrew School. And from 1942, while his father was conscripted, this time as a friendly alien in the 6th Australian Employment Company, Dad began walking with his mother every Shabbat morning to St Kilda Synagogue. From the age of 9, Dad attended services every Friday night as well. And after the Second World War, my grandfather became a regular mitpalel here, and he remained so until he died in 1981. It is therefore particularly appropriate that the Shloshim service, marking 30 days since my father left this world, is being held here at St Kilda Synagogue. Rabbi Jacob Danglo, who led this synagogue for more than half a century, between 1905 and 1957, had a powerful impact on my grandparents and on my father. In a speech my father delivered in 1980 on the 100th anniversary of Rabbi Danglo's birth, Dad said that when Rabbi Danglo stood in the pulpit, this pulpit, delivering his sermons, he could as a child imagine no other occupant. This is how Dad described Rabbi Danglo in that speech. Preeminent always, dark, a suntanned face, an iron grey moustache, black canonicals relieved a little by the bands of white at his throat, and draped in a silk talit with blue stripes, a tiny replica of which I and every boy in the synagogue wore in those days. Although he could not imagine anyone else occupying the pulpit, as an 8-year-old attending Sunday school, on one occasion Dad was directed to go into the shul, ascend the pulpit and read from the singer's prayer book until he was told to stop. A microphone was being installed for some occasion and the electrician wanted to test its effectiveness. Dad said, "I mounted the steps with trepidation. The view I had was breathtaking, but I was also seized by a terrible fear. What if Rabbi Danglo should at that moment come through the door and see me? He would surely thunder, 'Get out!' and banish me forever from the shul." Dad celebrated his bar mitzvah in this shul on the 21st of February 1948, Parashat Tetzaveh. He remembers standing in the warden's box as Rabbi Danglo implored him to conduct himself so as to be a source of pride to his parents, his family and his school. Exactly 3 months later, on the 21st of May 1948, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the declaration formally establishing the State of Israel. And Dad recalls attending a special Thanksgiving service in this shul after the establishment of Medinat Yisrael. He said, "Rabbi Danglo delivered a sermon that I remember. It was on the theme that Israel should be a Jewish state. And when the choir, which throughout the war had sung the national anthem to end the service, concluded instead with Hatikva, I knew the world had changed. Whatever happened, my life and the life of my contemporaries would thereafter in large degree be bound up with the life and future of Israel." And of course Dad's words were prescient, because it would be in Israel where he would fall in love with Mum in the summer of 1957. And it would be in Israel, where my brother Anthony and my sister Ellie would make their homes, and together with Michal and Michael would raise their families. And it would be in Israel where we would celebrate Mum and Dad's 60th wedding anniversary just last year, returning to the place where it all began, but this time surrounded by 35 of their children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And it will be in Israel tomorrow that a Shloshim service will take place in Modi'in, arranged by Anthony and Ellie, at which a Siyum Mishnayot will be conducted, marking the special learning that's been undertaken in Dad's memory during the last 30 days. Dad continued to attend this synagogue regularly until he sailed to England to commence postgraduate study at Oxford in 1956. And in later years, Dad continued to attend here on those days when he could drive to shul. So he'd return to this synagogue, the synagogue of his youth, to celebrate the triumph of Purim and to commemorate the tragedy of Tisha B'Av, and on other occasions as well. As a boy, Dad also continued his formal Jewish education at the Hebrew school, attending classes on Shabbat mornings after shul, on Sunday mornings, and on Monday, Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Dad's life changed completely when in March 1950, the Reverend Bert Reschner, then assistant minister at this synagogue and headmaster of the Hebrew school, appointed Dad, then aged 15, to be a teacher in the Hebrew school, responsible for a class of 10 and 11-year-old boys and girls. Dad said that the experience was to light the fires of enthusiasm for Jewish learning and for teaching in his impressionable mind. In his matriculation exams in 1951, Dad received first-class honours in Hebrew. And in each year of his law degree, Dad continued to study Biblical Hebrew and Aramaic at Melbourne University in the Department of Semitic Studies under the renowned leadership of Professor Morris David Goldman. While Dad received his formal education at St Kilda Hebrew School, his informal Jewish education was probably more influential. Of course, it came primarily from his home, from his parents, from his father in particular, who as a young boy had been a Talmudic prodigy and was well versed in Jewish law and practice. And Dad recalls being taught by his father to read Rashi, and together with him studying the biblical commentaries on the weekly Torah portion. His father also taught him to read and write in Yiddish, which had been my father's Mamaloshin, his mother tongue, from the time he could speak. But Dad's informal Jewish education also came from two other principal sources. From the age of 11 until he was 14, Dad attended an informal gathering called Oneg Shabbos, organised and led by a young man named Eli Lobenstein. And Eli spoke to them about the forthcoming Jewish holidays, or about an episode in the Torah reading of the week, or about Tallis and Tefillin, or about all manner of matters Jewish, and made sure that every person in the group felt an important participant. Dad later wrote of these days, "I didn't see Eli often after the end of Oneg Shabbos. I remember him today with undiminished fondness and with deep respect. What he did for me and my Oneg Shabbos companions, he did because he wanted to ensure that we Melbourne Jewish kids understood how wonderful was our inheritance and how precious was each Shabbos that we enjoyed." The second major influence on Dad of an informal kind was B'nai Akiva, and between the ages of 12 and 21, a large part of his life was lived in that religious Zionist youth movement. As a madrich or youth leader, Dad welcomed the opportunity for autonomy and independence, and his own madrichim left indelible impressions upon him, particularly Arnold Bloch, Alav HaShalom, who showed Dad that Jewish learning and secular study not only could but should merit equal attention, and that the insights from one could illuminate the other. The seeds of Jewish life and learning that were planted in Dad as a boy took root and flourished, imbuing his life with a spiritual dimension that permeated everything he did thereafter. Dad returned to Melbourne in 1959, having obtained a BCL from Oxford with first-class honours, but more importantly, having met and married Mum. Their first home was a flat in Glenhuntly Road, Elwood, So for about 3 years, from June 1959, Dad would attend Elwood Talmud Torah congregation, and he especially enjoyed listening to the davening of Chazan Adler, who he described as a superb Baal Tefillah, free of prima donnish characteristics. In 1962, Mum and Dad moved to Hartley Avenue, and Dad began a lifelong association with another very different synagogue. In fact, in name, not a synagogue or Beit Knesset, but a Beit Midrash, a house of learning, the Caulfield Beit HaMidrash, colloquially known to many as Katanga. Interestingly, Dad rarely, if ever, used that appellation, referring to it simply as the Beis Medrash. It had no ornate sanctuary, no imposing dome, no Anglo-Jewish heritage, indeed no official rabbi. Instead, it comprised devout and learned Holocaust survivors whose mother tongue was Yiddish. Dad enjoyed its simplicity and its authenticity, and he forged close personal relationships with generations of its mitpalalim. For at least the last 20 years, Dad would speak on Shabbat afternoons twice a year on Parashat Mishpatim and Parashat Shoftim, whose Torah readings dealt with legal matters. Dad, the public teacher of law, enjoyed preparing and delivering those intimate lectures in which he would skillfully weave his own experiences, insights and reflections into the biblical text. He delivered his last such talk just 2 months ago. Dad's final appearance at his beloved base... Dad's final appearance at his beloved Beis Medrash was on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, less than 6 weeks ago. His last public pronouncement that day was to recite the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing, which he always did with pride and, more importantly, b'ahava, with love. The memory of that day will remain with me forever. Dad's affiliation with and his attraction to these very different places of worship, St Kilda Hebrew Congregation and the Caulfield Beis HaMidrash, speaks to his openness to different forms of Orthodox Jewish expression. Dad understood the need for fidelity to tradition, to halacha, but he accepted that there were shivim panim laTorah, many ways of expressing that connection. That openness to different outlooks and approaches characterised Dad's involvement with a vast range of Jewish organisations during his life, in education, in welfare and in communal life. With Bert Reschner, Dad assisted the newly established Moriah College, which we attended as children in the 1960s, and later when we moved to Mount Scopus College, Dad chaired its education committee. He helped establish programs to enhance tertiary Jewish study at both Monash University and the University of Melbourne. He served as chairman of the advisory committee of the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization at Monash, which is dedicated to teaching about the evolution of Jewish civilization and its contribution to the world. He also served on the board of governors of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and of Tel Aviv University. He was instrumental in the development of the Hillel Foundation, promoting Jewish life on university campus. And he was instrumental also in the establishment of the Australian Academics for Peace in the Middle East. Together with Mum, for decades he was actively involved in B'nai B'rith, and more recently with Courage to Care, Makor Library and Jewish Care. And throughout his life, Dad's love of learning never ceased, his study overflowing with books, especially of Jewish law and lore, L-O-R-E, as he would say, spilling into bookshelves in every room of their home. In recent years, Dad rekindled his love of Yiddish, topping the state in VCE Yiddish and attending weekly conversation classes. In a recently published book by Susan Barty on pioneering Australian legal scholars, she writes that as a law teacher, together with Peter Brett, My father's goal was not simply to produce competent legal practitioners, but to foster a sense of moral awareness in their students and to impress upon them the onerous moral responsibilities which lawyers faced. In teaching criminal law, Dad would commence his first lecture with a famous case of the Queen against Dudley and Stevens, involving human cannibalism on the high seas, to illustrate to his students the tension that existed between law and morality. That lesson and the issues it raised remain with Dad's students throughout their lives. As a pioneering law reformer, much of Dad's work concerned the beginning and the end of life, and he had to grapple with the most difficult legal, social and ethical dilemmas thrown up by scientific and medical advances in IVF and assisted reproduction technology. An article featuring Dad in The Age in June of 1982 stated, "The professor's respect for human life is informed by his religious belief." And in the article, Dad was quoted as saying, "I am Jewish. It is part of the fabric of my life." And so it was, in everything that he was and in everything that he did. In his study of biblical Hebrew at university and in the years since, Dad would read the verse in the book of Micha where the prophet says, "Higid lecha Adam, ma tov u'ma Hashem doresh mimcha, ki im asot mishpat ve'avat chesed ve'hatznei lechet im Elohecha." He has told you, O man, what is good and what the Lord demands of you, only that you do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. That simple yet profound verse encapsulates so beautifully Dad's life. A life devoted to justice, to teaching generations of lawyers, judges and legislators that the law must be an instrument of justice, to reforming the law so that it achieve that end, and to living a life of personal integrity. A life infused with kindness in his lifelong relationships and in his everyday interactions. And despite his enormous achievements, a life characterised by humility. To have been so close to someone who embodied these qualities is a privilege that Adina and I, and our children and our grandchildren will always cherish, and a constant reminder to us of what we should strive to be. In the speech he gave about Rabbi Danglo in 1980, my father recalled one final memory. It is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The shul is full, almost still, darkened by the approaching night. It is Ne'ilah, the final service on this holiest of holy days. On the bima, enveloped in white kittel and woolen talit, stands the rabbi. In Dad's description, the limpid words of the liturgical poem capture the scene and fix the atmosphere. Hayom yifneh, hashemesh yavo v'yifneh, navoa sha'arecha. The day is passing. The sun is low. The day is growing late. Oh, let us come into thy gates at last. Let me conclude with my final memory. Of my father. It is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Night has fallen. It is Kol Nidre, the first service on this holiest of holy days. But we are not in shul. We are gathered around Dad's hospital bed. Enveloped in white kittel and woolen talit. We sing the haunting melodies that have resonated with our people for centuries. Then we begin to recite our silent devotion. And as we symbolically beat our chests in confession, we see that Dad's chest is now still. The day has passed. The sun has now set, and Dad's soul is about to enter thy gates at last. Yehi Zichro Baruch. May his memory be a blessing.
The story of Louis's legal life has been told before, and it will be continued to be told, for he was a great human being and a great lawyer, loved by all. The story is one of a 3-year-old Pinchas Leib Valigora, born in Shedlitz, who arrived in Australia in March 1938, speaking only Yiddish, who rose to greatness as a wise scholar, a dedicated teacher, an outstanding student, an educator, a groundbreaking law reformer, and a master of the English language, always crisp, clear, and precise. And in accordance with the biblical injunction, he always pursued justice and pursued it justly. The current dean of the Monash Law School describes Louis as one of the giants on whose shoulders both Monash University and the Faculty of Law were built. As Ian has already told you, Louis's life as a teacher began here in this shul, in this Hebrew school, when in 1990, at the age of 15, and with 2 years to go as a student, he was appointed a teacher, joining a staff that included, amongst others, the Principal Reverend Reshner and Reverends Kavadlo and Berliner. He was both a teacher and pupil in his final 2 years, and of course, when he finished Dux. After his secondary schooling at University High School, and having won a Dafford Lewis Scholarship, Louis in 1952 entered the Melbourne University Law School, then at the forefront of legal education in Australia. It was headed by the dynamic, vibrant young Dean and Professor of Law, Public Law, Zolman Cowan. Professor David Derham, also young and a born leader, was Professor of Jurisprudence. Louis, the student, was profoundly affected by them both. It was their example which inspired Louis, as he has put it, to become a public teacher of law when he grew up. And they encouraged him and supported him in that ambition and in his wish to go on to Oxford. And he did go on to Oxford after he graduated Bachelor of Laws with honours in 1956. With another Dafford Lewis Scholarship, Louis, in the middle of 1956, left for Magdalen College, Oxford. In the months between graduation and departure, Louis was employed in the law school as a tutor and research assistant. Louis graduated from Oxford in 1958 with a Bachelor of Civil Law with first-class honours. By now married to Wendy, Louis returned to the Melbourne Law School in 1959, launching his own academic career as a senior lecturer. He was now a colleague of his two mentors, Professors Cowan and Derham, and part of the team that was changing the face of legal education in Australia. Louis was immediately recognised by his colleagues and students as a great teacher. One of his students, the now retired Judge of the High Court, Ken Hayne, described him as electric. Although he might have been at Monash as a student, the now Justice Mark Weinberg has described him as a great teacher, one of the best I ever encountered. Benjamin Franklin once said, "Tell me and I hope, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I learn." Louis's students learned. Louis was in partnership with his students. He encouraged them to adopt an intellectual approach to law. It was participatory learning. Students came or were expected to come to class having prepared the topic for discussion from the prescribed reading materials. They were expected to become involved in the discussion under Louis's guidance. Difficult legal concepts and principles were explored, critical thinking and reasoning skills were encouraged. The status quo was to be questioned. One of Louis's colleagues at Melbourne University and a great friend was Professor Peter Brett, to whom Ian has already referred. Together they revolutionised the teaching of criminal law in Australia, And in 1962 they published the first edition of the first Australian case book for teaching criminal law. Of this book, Cases and Materials in Criminal Law, Professor Rupert Cross, a famous professor from Oxford and one of Louis's important mentors, wrote, "I have no doubt that this good book, the first of its kind known to me on the criminal law of the Commonwealth, is something for which all teachers of law should be grateful and upon which the authors are to be warmly congratulated. The author's own contributions are uniformly first class. The whole emphasis is very properly on the stimulation of thought and discussion." Mark Weinberg, for many years one of our most distinguished criminal lawyers, has said that his understanding of the criminal law was shaped by this book, now in its 13th edition. In 1963, Professor Derham left Melbourne, having been appointed the Foundation Dean and the Sir Owen Dixon Professor of Law at the recently established Monash University. He was charged with building that law school. Teaching began in 1964. In that year, Louis and his friend and colleague Peter Brett visited from the Melbourne Law School as itinerant teachers of criminal law. In September of that year, Louis went off to Philadelphia for a year to the University of Pennsylvania as a bicentennial fellow in criminal law and administration. Shortly after his arrival there, Professor Derham, as his first professorial appointment, invited Louis to take up the Sir Leo Cusson Chair of Law. He was 29 at the time. His appointment is regarded as one of the most significant made by Professor Derham. And there he remained for 25 years until his retirement in 2000. His tenure was critical to the establishment and maintenance of the law school's unique collegiate culture for which it is admired, a collegiate culture in which students learn and academic talent is fostered. 2 years later, in 1967, Professor Derham left Monash to become the new Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne. Louis, at 32, became acting Dean, and then Dean from 1968 until 1970. Louis could have stayed on. Many wanted him to continue, but he didn't want the burden of administration. He wanted to focus on teaching and research. As an aside, things must have changed with time, for in 1987, the office of Vice-Chancellor at Monash became vacant. Louis was interested. He was shortlisted. He missed out. According to the tribute that Monash published on the 10th of October, Louis' response was, "I guess it was the first time I had applied for something that I didn't get." Louis published widely. His fields were criminal law, legal education, evidence, criminology, forensic medicine, the law and medicine, and law reform. He, together with David Derham and Frank Marr, wrote two important introductory texts for first-year law students, first published in 1966, and which ran through many editions. One is an introduction to law, and the other is Cases and Materials on the Legal Process. When Louis retired from his chair, his contribution to the faculty was celebrated at a valedictory dinner, at which the principal speech was given by Justice Michael Kirby, then of the High Court, as Ian has already referred to. And he said, and I may quote another part of his speech, "The boy from Shedlitz in Poland is the master of the English language. He deploys it with graphic skill, and that skill extends from the lecture hall to the printed page. We are the beneficiaries." Louis Waller, who has proudly borne the name of the Sir Leo Cusson Professor after one of the greatest of Australia's judges, is no full stop, nor is he a semicolon. He is a question mark, an exclamation mark, a couple of brackets, and many books yet to be filled. I honour him. And his work did continue. Many books and pages were filled. He continued at Monash as an active emeritus professor, retaining an office, teaching, mentoring, and writing until the end. Louis' wings extended well beyond Monash and the university. He travelled widely as a visiting scholar. In 1971, he was a visiting professor at the University of Kent in Canterbury. in England and a visiting scholar at Queen Mary College, a constituent part of the University of London. In 1974 and 1975, he was a consultant to the Law Reform Commission of Canada, based in Ottawa. In 1981, he was a visiting professor of law at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. In 1985 and 1986, he was a fellow of the Mortimer and Raymond Sackler Institute of Advanced Studies at Tel Aviv University. In 1990, he was the first Australian National Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh. In 1993 and 1994, he was a Fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And in 2007, he was made an Honorary Fellow at that university. And each of Tel Aviv University and the Hebrew University, as Ian has already told you, have made Louis a member of its Board of Governors. Outside the university, Louis made a vital contribution to law reform. He took leave from Monash between 1982 and 1984 and held office as the Law Reform Commissioner for the State of Victoria. At the conclusion of that time, he was appointed the first chair of the newly founded Law Reform Commission of Victoria for a year, and then continued as a part-time member until the end of 1992. His contributions resulted in significant reform, including to the law of sentencing for murder, giving judges the power to fix maximum sentences up to life, and doing away with mandatory life sentences. At the time of Louis's appointment to the Law Reform Commission, major research into infertility was occurring. The first IVF baby had been born in England. Monash was at the forefront of this cutting research. In 1982, the Victorian government established the committee to consider the social, ethical and legal issues arising from IVF. Louis was its chair, and given the long-winded title, the committee was rapidly became known as the Waller Committee. His report led to the Infertility Medical Procedure Act, the first legislation in the world to regulate IVF and human embryo research. That statute also established the Standing Review and Advisory Committee on Infertility, which Louis chaired until the end of 1993, when it was replaced by the Infertility Treatment Authority, which Louis chaired until 2001. Louis's expertise in the field of law and medicine was otherwise employed both inside and outside the university. Within the university, he was responsible for the development of combined law and medical degrees. He developed and taught medical subjects to law students and law subjects to medical students. Outside the university, Louis served for many years on the Ethics Committee of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research, including a term as its chairman. He was a lay member of the Appeals Committee of the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons, and in 1995 he was elected to the Court of Honour of the College for distinguished service to it. Louis had made other important contributions, humanitarian contributions, in his legal life. He was the foundation president in 1972 of the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service. He was active in the Australian Red Cross. Between 1978 and 1985, he was the first chair of its Humanitarian Law Committee. In 1985, he was made an honorary life member of the Australian Red Cross. In 1977, Louis was appointed a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Sciences. In 2005, Monash University granted him an Honorary Doctorate of Laws. In 1989, Australia made him an Officer of the Order of Australia for services to the legal community, particularly as a teacher and to the community. The law school established the Louis Waller Chair and has established a scholarship fund, the Louis Waller Global Impact Awards Endowment, to provide opportunities for meritorious and deserving students and young academics. And so, without having done justice to a man who was very important in my life, I must come to a full stop in this story of the legal life of Peter Louis Waller. Pinchas Yehuda ben Yaakov Dov HaKohen Zichrono Livracha.
These last 30 days have been a time of pain and sadness, yet have also provided an opportunity for retrospection. We have been able to spend time with our families, both nuclear and extended, and have been comforted by the many who have either visited Hartley Avenue or sent messages. There have been many, There have been many tributes received by our family detailing the impressions left upon friends, former students, members of the legal fraternity, the academic world, and the broader community by our Zayda, Louis Walla, Zichrono Livracha. The references on the radio, in newspapers, at school assemblies, and in the Monash Law Library to the man I simply knew as Zayda Louis, a testament to the far-reaching impact of his words and actions. As John Fain, during his penultimate radio segment, noted, if you've ever used IVF, or you know anyone who has used IVF, or if you think IVF is a good thing, you've got Louis Walla to thank. And his work on IVF comprised only a fraction of his achievements. During an awards ceremony a few years ago, when awarded the JCCV General Sir John Monash Award, Zayda's CV was read out by the speaker introducing him. I listened to a seemingly endless catalogue of achievements being listed and stared in amazement at the figure on stage who was a giant to all who knew him. Who was this man who had succeeded time and time again? Who was this man who had achieved so much and contributed to both the general and Jewish communities in so many ways? Who was this man to whom so many deferred? To me and my siblings, Yaakov, Gidon and Amira, and to our cousins in Israel, he was simply Zayda. As a young child, I was always fascinated by the top shelf of the bookcase in the family room at 2 Hartley Avenue. On that shelf were a row of owls, the largest collection of owl figurines that I have ever seen, both then and now. These objects had come from all over the world, many as gifts from students and from friends. When I would inquire why there were so many owls on the shelf, I would be told simply that Zayda liked them. I never gave it much thought at the time. On reflection, it comes as no surprise that Zayda identified with this most unusual creature. There were so many characteristics of the owl that Zayda shared. Perhaps, first and foremost, was that it was unusual. Zayda was never one to walk the beaten path, but instead was a trailblazer. Zayda was constantly at or near the top of his class during his school and university careers and received scholarships and awards throughout. Rather than following his classmates into legal practice, he chose to be an academic, to teach. There is an unkind saying that those who can't teach. But Zayda demonstrated that those who can teach brilliantly. The owl is a nocturnal creature, preferring to be active at night rather than during the day. Whilst most of the world is resting, the owl goes about its activities quietly and has accomplished much when the rest of the world wakes. Similarly, Zayda was a humble man whose achievements were not broadcast to the world, but rather completed quietly. Even when Zayda started to walk slowly and carefully, he still possessed a lightning-fast mind and an observant eye that absorbed everything. And when he spoke, he would focus his entire attention on the one person with whom he was conversing. And for those moments, you felt as though you were the centre of his world. I remember how Zayda would delight in personally delivering flowers to our house when we hosted him and Grandma for a meal, and how honoured he was to have been invited, yet the honour was of course ours. How fitting it is that Zayda, a teacher of judges, displayed the same humility for which Moshe, Moses, leader of our nation and teacher of judges, is famous. Being a nocturnal creature, the owl's vision, particularly in low light, is exceptionally good. Being able to discern objects in limited lighting conditions enables the owl to perceive things others cannot see, and to see beyond what is immediately apparent. Zayda well understood the complexity of human interactions, that often things are not as they seem. He appreciated the importance of seeing things in context, examining peripheral aspects rather than focusing solely on the central element. At family meals, Zayda would contribute to discussion, with the conversation invariably reviewing the legal affairs that my father was involved in. But while the table was being cleared and attention was on other matters, he would often pull me aside to ask me for my opinion on an issue or simply to ask how I was faring. And just as the owl is able to rotate its neck to see in a near complete circle, Zayda did not miss a thing. Whether it was a raised eyebrow, a wry smile, it was evident that Zayda had absorbed everything that happened around him, and he would respond with wisdom and warmth to better guide us all. In the prayer of Shmona Esrei, the fourth blessing is Atah Chonen. The bracha reads, Atah Chonen la'adam da'at u'melamed le'enosh bina. You grace humans with wisdom and teach humanity perception. In an article I recently read, Dr. Erica Brown explains that on a daily basis we are required to problem solve and navigate life's complexities. With wisdom, we have the ability to make good choices. Without it, poor alternatives that may have ill-fated and long-lasting consequences. Zayda's counsel could be relied upon to gently correct course and set us on the right path each and every time. The owl is a symbol of wisdom. Perhaps this is what drew Zayda to this creature. With its hearing and vision surpassing those of others, the owl is thought to absorb information and possess great wisdom. As has been mentioned by others, Zayda's phenomenal ability to draw upon experiences from the near and distant past and recount these memories in exquisite detail was astounding. He could remember jumping in a puddle in Shedlitz at the age of 2. He could recall almost all of his students and even the marks they received. And he did not forget the ensemble Grandma was wearing when they first met. And these were not memories to be merely recounted periodically. Instead, Zayda's ability to draw upon these occurrences while we sat around the table, imparting the wisdom he had gained by experience, made me sit there in awe. There seemed to be nothing he had not seen, experienced, or heard in the past, and his insatiable curiosity continually added to his bank of knowledge. When we would ask Zayda a question, be it about current affairs or his personal experiences, he would grin with excitement at the opportunity to share his knowledge with us. At our last meal together on Rosh Hashanah, I sat with Zayda as the table was being cleared. See that sugar bowl in the cabinet, he said to me, pointing to a silver sugar bowl with a little spoon. My teeth marks are on that spoon. Zayda then proceeded to tell me the story behind that sugar bowl, a story of friendship, about his mother as a new immigrant to Australia, and about long-standing family connections that all related to this seemingly unimportant sugar bowl. That was my Zayda. Nothing was as it appeared. For everything there was a story, a lesson to be learned, a connection to something of importance, and he imparted his wisdom through storytelling. This desire to continually learn, even when he knew so much, married well with the motto of his beloved Monash University, Ancora Imparo, I am still learning. Zayda travelled abroad on a number of sabbaticals with his family to both learn from and contribute to the knowledge of others. When we went to Vancouver on fellowship last year, Zayda was so excited that we were following in his footsteps in Canada, and in particular when we visited the shul in which he had davened in Victoria on Vancouver Island. It was a special feeling to be able to share these experiences with Zayda, and he remembered those places as though it were yesterday. The routine of the owl is predictable, and so too was life at Hartley Avenue. When we would come for a Shabbat meal, each person knew the location of their assigned seat. Even when there were guests invited, we knew the location of our replacement seat. Gidon had the task of bringing the drinks to the table, Yaakov of serving the cherry herring and whiskey, Amira the benches for grace after meals. Even my 4-year-old Dahlia, Zayda's great-grandchild, took the dessert orders. There was a security in the familiarity of Grandma and Zayda's home. Zayda would be excited to trial new experiences and foods, but he always reverted to his traditional favourites, salmon patties, chicken soup and roast beef. When we visited there, we knew where he would be sitting in the family room, knew he would beckon us over saying, "Come here, darling, so I can look at you," and receive a kiss on the cheek, and knew he would shriek with delight upon hearing or seeing the great-grandchildren reach new milestones. The owl is differentiated from many other avian species in their devotion to their family and to their partner. Zayda and Grandma's unwavering dedication to each other established an ideal toward which I have striven to reach. Last Sukkot, just over a year ago, the entire extended Walla family united in Israel to celebrate Grandma and Zayda's 60th wedding anniversary. For the first time, every family member had been able to attend such a gathering. This momentous occasion was obviously emotional for Zayda. In Zayda's words, "We have been extraordinarily blessed by the Ribono Shel Olam, the Creator, with good fortune." He spoke about how proud he was of his children and their choices of partners, and of his grandchildren and their choices of partners. Indeed, Zayda was especially attentive to his in-law family members, lavishing affection upon them as though they were his own flesh and blood. I was fortunate enough to grow up witnessing this warmth directed at my mother, and then later with my husband Mark and sister-in-law Leah. At each of the family events during the Israel trip, he remarked how fortunate he was. He had never imagined meeting his grandchildren, let alone contemplating the possibility of so many great-grandchildren, 11 at the time. Zayda singled out a phrase from Tehillim, Psalms, which in his mind captured the greatest idea with the smallest number of words. Ure'ei vanim levanecha, shalom al Yisrael. And may you see children born to your children and see peace upon Israel. If you merit seeing grandchildren, not to mention great-grandchildren, then shalom al Yisrael. All your hard work will have been worthwhile. You will have achieved the greatest achievement possible, and you will be at peace. And perhaps that was when Zayda was most at peace in the end, surrounded by all his children and many of his grandchildren from both Israel and Australia. A number of years ago, Zayda had a fall and fractured his hip. Not wanting to be separated from him, a few days later, Grandma fell and fractured her hip. After both had undergone their respective surgeries and were discharged from hospital, they shared a room at rehab, which Zayda referred to as the honeymoon suite. Just as Zayda was in other aspects of his life, their love for each other was without fanfare, but yet had such depth that it was obviously extraordinary. As a morning routine, Zayda would bring Grandma breakfast in bed. Even in the last few weeks, when he needed a walker to safely navigate the house, he would balance Grandma's breakfast precariously on his walker and complete this important task. Being the eldest grandchild in Melbourne, my place at the Shabbos table was next to Grandma, and it was from this vantage point that I was witness to the subtle looks of adoration shared between the two and the surreptitious hand-holding under the table. From the day he met her on the train in Israel, for the next 62 years, his foremost concerns were for Grandma and his family, and we felt it. The home that Grandma and Zayda built can be likened to a tree. The roots were grounded in love, the trunk comprised mutual respect, the branches stretched out with wisdom, and the leaves provided the shelter of unconditional acceptance. Whilst the love at first sight that Grandma and Zeta experienced all those years ago was the beginning of their extraordinary relationship, it was the strength gained from the respect and admiration which Grandma and Zeta had for each other that allowed their tree to grow so tall and to provide a safe haven for the owl, for my Zeta. A man of exceptional foresight and humility, wisdom and devotion to his family. We wish Grandma much strength and hope to make her and Zeta proud of us by emulating the extraordinary example they have set.